He looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from over her mouth, and she lay still. I don't want to hurt you, he said, but George will be mad if you yell. When she didn't answer, nor move, he bent closely over her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered, and then he whispered in fright, I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing. He pawed up the hay until it partly covered her. From outside the barn came a cry of men and the double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time, Lenny became conscious of the outside. He crouched down in the hay and listened. I done a real bad thing, he said. I shouldn't have done that. George will be mad, and he said, and hide in the brush till he come. He's gonna be mad in the brush till he come. That's what he said. Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. I'll throw him away, he said. It's bad enough like it is. He put the pup under his coat, and he crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks toward the horseshoe game. And then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled and flew out again. Around the last stall came a shepherd cow, lean and long, with heavy hanging dungs. Halfway to the packing box, there were puppies where she caught the dead scent of Curly's wife, and the hair arose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rogued cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. As happens, sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment. And sound stopped and movement stopped for much more than a moment. Then, gradually, time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of the feeding racks, and the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. From around the end of the last stall, Candy's voice came. Lenny, he called. Oh, Lenny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. Tell you what we can do, Lenny. Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. Oh, Lenny, he called again. And then he stopped. His body stiffened. He rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubble whiskers. I didn't know you was here, he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped nearer. You ought not to sleep out here, he said disapprovingly. And then he was beside her and said, Oh, no. He looked about helplessly, and he rubbed his beard. Then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their bedding, and they clashed the chains with their halters. In a moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. George said, What was it you wanted to see me about? Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. What's the matter with her? He asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. Oh, no. He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally, when he stood up, slowly and stiffly, his face was hard and tight as wood. His eyes were hard. Candy said, What done it? George looked coldly at him. Ain't you got any idea? He asked. And Candy was silent. I shoulda knew. George said hopelessly, I guess maybe way back in my head I did. Candy asked, What are we going to do now, George? What are we going to do now? George was a long time answering. Guess we got to tell the guys. I guess we got to get him and lock him up. We can't let him get away. Why, the poor guy would starve. And he tried to reassure himself. Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him. But Candy said excitedly, Why, we ought to let him get away. You don't know that, Curly. Curly's going to want to get him lynched. Curly will get him killed. George watched Candy's lips. Yeah, he said at last, that's right, Curly will. And the other guys will. And he looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke his greatest fear. You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice. Can't we, George? Can't we? Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do it. He used to hear about it so much. I got to thinking maybe we would. Then it's all off? Candy said sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, I'll work my month and I'll take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house. Or I'll sit in some pool room till everybody goes home. And then I'll come back and work another month. And I'll have 50 more bucks. Candy said, he's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do anything like this. George still stared at Curly's wife. Lenny never done it in meanness, he said. All the time he done bad things. But he never did any of 'em mean. He straightened up and looked back at Candy. Now listen, we gotta tell the guys. We gotta bring him in. I guess. There ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him, he said sharply. I ain't gonna let him hurt Lenny. Now you listen. The guys might think I was in on it. I'm gonna go in the bunk house. Then, in a minute, you come out and tell the guys about her. And I'll come along and make it seem like I never seen her. Will you do that? So the guys think I wasn't in on it? Candy said, sure, George. Sure, I'll do that. Okay, give me a couple minutes then, and then you come running out and tell like you just found her. I'm going now. George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. You tramp, he said viciously. You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody knew you messed things up. You wasn't no good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart. He sniveled, and his voice shook. I could have hoed up in a garden and washed dishes for them guys. He paused, and then he went on in a sing-song, and he repeated the old words. If there was a circus or a baseball game, we would have went to her. Just said, to hell with work, and went to her. Never asked anybody to say so. And there would have been pigs and chickens, and in the winter, a little fat stove, and the rain coming, and just sitting there. His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn. He rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum of running feet, and the men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson and young Whit and Curly and Crooks, keeping back out of attention range. Candy came after them, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men raced around the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom. They stopped and stood still and looked. Then Slim went over to her, and he felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. When he stood up, the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. I know who done it, he cried. That big guy done it. I know he done it. Why, everybody else was out here playing horseshoes. He worked himself into a fury. I'm going to get him. I'm going for my shotgun. I'll kill the big guy myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys. He ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, I'll get my Luger, and he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. I guess Lenny done it all right, he said. Her neck's busted. Lenny could have done that. George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered. Slim went on. Maybe like that time in Weed you was telling about? Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. Well, I guess we got to get him. Where do you think he might have went off to? It seemed to take George some time to free his words. He would have went south, he said. We come from north, so he would have went south. I guess we got to get him, Slim repeated. George stepped close. Couldn't we maybe bring him in, and they'll lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never would have done this to be mean. Slim nodded. We might, he said. If we could keep Curly in, we might. But Curly's going to want to shoot him. Curly's still mad about his hand, and suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage? That ain't no good, George. I know, said George. I know. Carlson came running in. That guy stole my Luger, he shouted. It ain't my bag. Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. All right, you guys, he said. The stable buck's got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see turn, don't give him no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over. Whit said excitedly, I ain't got a gun. Curly said, you go in Soledad and get a cop. Get old Wits. He's the deputy sheriff. Let's go now. He turned suspiciously on George. You're coming with us, fella. Yeah, said George. I'll come. But listen, Curly. The poor guy's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing. Don't shoot him? Curly cried. He's got Carlson's Luger. Of course I'm going to shoot him. George said weakly, maybe Carlson lost his gun. I seen it this morning, said Carlson. No, it's been took. Slim stood, looking down at Curly's wife. He said, Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife. Curly's face reddened. I'm going, he said. I'm going to shoot the guts out of that big guy myself. Even if I only got one hand, I'm going to get him. Slim turned to Candy. You stay here with her then, Candy. The rest of us better get going. They moved away. George stopped a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly called, You, George, you stick with us, so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. George moved slowly after them, and his feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. Poor girl, he said softly. The sound of the men grew fainter, and the barn was darkening gradually, and in their stalls the horses shifted their feet and rattled the halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arms.